Hello, and welcome to Climate Solutions in Color, a conversation with Matt Scott, Ben Passer, Clara, Kitongo, and Jacqueline Patterson. I'm Josna Harris, proud board member of the Great Northern and founder and principal of Change Narrative, which builds capacity in the climate justice movement through the power of our stories. And I'm joining you today from Minnesota on the indigenous land of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. And I'd like to invite you all now to introduce yourselves in the chat. So take a moment to do that now, share who you are, and if you know the native lands that you are on, please include that too. We'll also include a link in the chat where you can look that up. Today, we are kicking off Black History Month with Solutions in Color to highlight Black climate and energy leaders who are here with us to share their experiences and stories. This event is part of the Great Northern Festival and is just one of the dozens of programs, including performances, art installations, outdoor activations, and solutions-focused climate talks over 10 days in January and February that invigorate the mind and body. Today's conversation is part of our climate series, which has events running daily through February 6th. And you can see a full listing of events on our website at thegreatnorthernfestival.com. And we'd like to invite you to support the Great Northern's ability to produce more conversations like this by giving a tax-deductible donation on our website. We also want to take this opportunity to thank the McKnight Foundation, the Minneapolis Foundation, Greater MSP, and DEED for their funding of our climate series. Before we get started with the program, there are a few housekeeping items that you will want to note. You'll notice a chat bar on the side of your screen, and that is the place where you can introduce yourself if you haven't already. You can share words of encouragement to our speakers, and it's also a place where you can have community conversation. You'll also notice that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and this is the place to ask questions that will be directed towards our speakers. And at the end of our program, we'll have some time for Q&A to incorporate a few of your questions. Also, if you would like to activate closed captioning, you'll notice a CC button at the bottom of your screen where you can activate that. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Solutions in Color. Project Drawdown, our partner for this event, shared this framing for today. As we begin Black History Month, this event focuses on the importance of creating more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and just spaces for climate solutions, with an eye toward the past, present, and future. Today's event celebrates the launch of Climate Solutions in Color, an initiative by Project Drawdown and led by Matt Scott, who will guide the conversation today with Black leaders who are real-world climate heroes, and debuting Drawdown's Neighborhood, Pittsburgh, which is a short documentary series that shares ways that we can all help pass the mic. With us today are Ben Passer, Senior Program Officer for the Midwest Climate and Energy Program at the McKnight Foundation, and is also a licensed attorney. We also have Clara Kitongo, Program Coordinator for One Tree Per Child at Tree Pittsburgh, which focuses on reforesting and transforming the landscape of Pittsburgh with the future generation of leaders. And Jacqueline Patterson, who is the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black Frontline climate justice leadership. This conversation will be facilitated by Matt Scott, who leads storytelling at Project Drawdown, and whose work focuses on amplifying the underrepresented, underestimated changemakers who've often gone unheard. And with that, please give a warm welcome in the chat as I pass the mic to Matt Scott.
Thank you so much, Josna, for that introduction and for welcoming all of us here for this conversation. And the very first thing that I want to do, number one, is just acknowledge that I'm currently on Munsee Lenape land, where I am. And I also want to start out by asking all of the folks, all of you who are tuned in, a simple question that you could respond to in the chat. What comes to mind when you think of global warming and climate change? Feel free to respond with a word, a few words, whatever comes to mind in the chat. Um, and continue to add in your introductions as well. I'm already seeing some responses to the question, though. Rising oceans, change, wildfires, rising sea levels, disease, crisis. There are so many different words that are running by so quickly. So continue to add those into the chat. I ask this question each and every time I give a presentation because it's so interesting to see the things that come to mind when we think of global warming and climate change. And also to look at the work that we do at Project Drawdown as an opportunity to rewrite that narrative and shift from what normally comes to mind, the inequality, the destruction of our planet, to things that we want to embrace, solutions for one. When 14,000 people were asked this question of what comes to mind when you think of global warming and climate change, 44% responded with outcomes, 18% responded with causes, but only 3% responded with solutions. And that's really where I come in and where my work at Project Drawdown comes in. For those who don't know, Project Drawdown is known as the world's leading resource for climate solutions. And for those who don't know what drawdown, that funny word means, drawdown is the future point in time when greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline. And that's what we're working toward in all of our work at Project Drawdown. So today, some of the ways that you might interact with Project Drawdown are through the educational video series, Climate Solutions 101, through our Climate Solutions at Work Employee Action Guide, through our Drawdown Lift policy brief on health and education with a focus on girls and women in particular. But today I want to talk about stories and the role that that my work, that the work that so many people you hear from today does, how that all leads to this point of drawdown. The big challenge that we face that we'll be discussing in this panel is that far too often those most immediately and severely affected by global warming and climate change are often not in the room. We know that climate organizations are overwhelmingly white, and it's so important that we integrate different diverse perspectives because we need to solve climate change. We need to work to end global warming, and it's going to take solutions and perspectives. It's an all hands on deck effort, and I'm excited to introduce some of the folks who are part of that effort and part of that work as we launch Climate Solutions in Color. So to start out, I want to mention our very first panelist in this conversation, Clara Kitongo, who's with One Tree Per Child at Tree Pittsburgh, Ben Passer, who's the Senior Program Officer of the Midwest Climate and Energy Program at McKnight Foundation, and also a board member of Climate Generation. And also, finally, Jackie Patterson, who's the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. So without further ado, I want to welcome all of our panelists to join me. Thank you so much for joining, Ben, Clara, and Jackie. And, you know, as we start out and dive in, I mentioned just the lack of diversity in the climate space. And that's something that I know I think about a lot, especially as a Black person in the climate space. But I actually want to give you the floor rather than starting out to talk about the problem. I want to know, what is it that's brought you to this point to work in the climate space? In short, what's your climate story for each of you, and what's motivated you to do the work that you're doing? Maybe we start out with Clara.
Yes, thank you so much, Matt, and hello to everyone. I started my journey into environmental work through an environmental justice class that I did in college. And actually what really moved me was the work by Wangari Maathai and her work with the Greenbelt movement, where she empowered African women to really take back their land through planting trees. A land that was deforested because of construction was transformed through tree planting. And I was just moved by those small actions that led to change. And further, it was cemented by Majora Carter's work in the South Bronx, where she did revitalization work in the South Bronx and basically turned this mess of a place into like an ecological park. And those two women really made me see this is the kind of work I want to do on the ground, to raise those voices.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And speaking of women on the ground doing this work, it makes me think of, Jackie, some of your work as the convener of Women of Color United. But what's your climate story?
Yeah, thank you. So my climate story is similar in seeing the women who were leading on climate, even if they weren't necessarily naming it as leading on climate. They were leading on work around food justice around the country. They were leading on work on disaster equity, post-disasters, and really rebuilding their communities in a way that centers resilience. They were leading around work on access to energy, clean energy. And so and so it was both kind of born out of the problem in terms of disaster and born out of seeing women in particular in the United States and abroad leading on solutions. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting to see these patterns. Ben, how does your climate story relate to Clara's and Jackie's?
Thanks, Matt. Good to see you. Good to be with you, Clara and Jackie. And hi, everyone. So, I think I'm going to maybe buck the trend here, but my climate story is one that's been, kind of a winding road. I would say it's been one of exposure and experimentation and experience. So I was never really someone who knew what I wanted to do when I grew up. But, as a young person, I think I was introduced to climate and environmental issues through exposures to things like new technologies. I remember being a college freshman and seeing an advertisement for, I think, a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle and thinking it was just the coolest thing ever. And then, I enrolled in law school, not totally knowing where I saw myself in the vocation, but the clerkships that I had during law school just kind of happened to be associated with energy and environmental issues. But then on a more personal level, in 2016, Philando Castile was killed just a mile from my childhood home. And I think it was at that point that I really felt, for the first time, this collision of race and place. And I understood that whatever I did in my life needed to address that intersection. Whatever I did with the majority of my time on this earth had to confront that issue of race and place. So I would say that my climate story and really what motivated me to do the work that I'm doing is just, really taking in the world around me, seeing the state of the world and the systems we've created and knowing that things can change, but they're not going to unless we're intentional about it. And that's really what brought me to the work I'm doing today.
Yeah, it's really powerful to hear the different angles with each of you, how you've ended up doing the work that you're doing, because like from my perspective, I focus so much on stories and helping people see themselves through the work I'm doing at Project Drawdown and otherwise. But it's motivated in large part by what you said, Ben, which is just that there are these lived experiences that we have as Black people that might, or even as people who are wherever we are with whatever identities we have, right? That motivate us to do the work that we're doing. I'm so curious from each of you though, like what is it that's motivated you to we've talked about what motivates you to do your work overall, but kind of like what's the thing that's drawn you to prioritizing climate justice in particular with the communities that you work with, and feel free, anyone, to kind of start us out.
I'm waiting for Jackie to unmute, and here I go. So personally, I feel like the communities that have suffered the most deserve the highest, they deserve to become the happiest. They deserve to have the access because unfortunately, or the climate effects go to those who have been marginalized and left out of the conversation. And so if we're gonna move towards justice in climate, we need to go to the areas that have historically been disinvested, because unless we deal with that, we're only fixing, we're only putting bandages. We're not really going to the root of the issue. So for me, I really feel it's so crucial to get to that root, because once we can fix that, then we have a chance of navigating this bigger system that's so complicated. Yeah. Jackie, you want to add anything to that? I wanted to just call you out.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Yeah, so similarly, as just picking up on the use of the term root, that in a way the methods and the the systems change that's needed to address climate justice is the same systems change that's needed to address these other convergent crises that we're seeing in our nation and world, really. So this Mayor Steve Benjamin from Columbia, South Carolina, I believe, said that COVID-19 served as an X-ray to expose the broken bones of American societal systems. And I thought that was such a poignant way of putting it. And it is true. And it's really those same broken bones in terms of corporatocracy, in terms of an extractive economy, and how it's making certain communities more vulnerable and making our entire system fraught with vulnerabilities that drives me in terms of climate justice, but also seeing, as Clara was saying, what the possibilities are. We're seeing communities rising up and doing it differently, seeing that we don't have to have this extractive economy where there's winners and losers, that we can all win with a solidarity economy. So that's what drives me around climate justice. Thank you. And
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to hearing from you as well.
Yeah, and I'll even jump in to mention I'm so curious, Ben, as you kind of talk about you've mentioned a little bit about what has drawn you to the work you do generally, but I'm wondering, are there certain barriers or challenges that that you see? And maybe this is a question for all of you, right? Are there certain barriers or challenges that that like underrepresented groups in particular, or maybe you want to focus more on Black communities specifically, any challenges and barriers that we face when it comes to being part of the solution with climate change and global warming?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Matt. And I think maybe I'll kind of start generally and then
Yeah.
shift to a little bit more personal. But I think just to build on what Clara and Jackie have said, really a lot of the systems, the inequitable systems that we have today are, because of either a lack of inclusion, just leaving folks away from the table, or intentionally excluding people. And that's examples like redlining in the housing sector, or the siting and operation of industrial facilities and waste sites around communities of color and under-resourced communities. And so really, I think a key barrier in the systems that we are dealing with today, and to Jackie's point, changing those systems is really, confronting that either, lack of inclusion or purposeful exclusion that we've, really had over time that have brought us to the systems that we have today. And I think that's, just first and foremost, the barrier, the set of barriers that we have to face. On a personal level, I think I talked about this a little bit, but when I started in this work, I didn't really see myself in it. The environmental and climate movement, as you mentioned, Matt, has long struggled with racial diversity and inclusion, and I really felt that firsthand. So, I think where we have barriers that we need to confront in this work is maybe pulling away from some of these highly technocratic discussions and data-driven outcomes. Not saying that those are bad, they are part of the work. That's part of the work of bringing down carbon pollution and really addressing climate change. But we also have to, look at the people-centered stories. We have to look at the impacts in communities and really, advance some of those conversations. And I think when I started sensing more of those conversations happening around me, really addressing equity first and foremost, that was when I started to feel like I belonged. And so I think really thinking about not just the data, not just the technology, not just the markets, those are all important things, but also thinking about the people and the communities that are at the root of these issues. I think that's going to get us further and farther faster. So I'll leave it there, but would love to hear what Clara and Jackie have to say as well.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm
Go ahead,
I'm
Ben.
so excited to hear what you have to say on this, Claire and Jackie. I just want to point out too, I relate so much to what you were saying, Ben, of not seeing yourself in this space. And really what it took for me was that I was sitting in a room of 2,000 people focused on climate change and still felt out of place as one of the as a definitely a minority in the room. And when a panel came up focused on climate justice, and it was people of color who spoke about the work in terms that really resonated with me personally, resonated with communities as part of, that's kind of what jumped out for me. Clara, I'm always love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sorry to jump in, but I think in terms of barriers and overcoming, exactly, I didn't feel like I belonged in some of these rooms, even when I had a passion for the environment, maybe because I didn't have the technical know-how, like the skill set, like you're talking about trees and names of trees, like there's things I did not know, but I was able to find people within the space. When I found a Black woman who was a leader, I was like, I want to talk to you and then she told me, well, you don't have to have the technical skill set to be in that room. You have to own your story and what you bring to that space. And that, of course, coupled with so much other support, I really credit the director of the organization where I work, who really led me back to this work. Having allies in the space that opened the door. And for me, overcoming my own sense of doubt in my ability to have a voice in this space, which now allows me to make sure when I see other young Black women in the space, try to create that opportunity for them to feel like, it doesn't have to be technical, but your voice matters. And we need it here so that we can diversify the type of solutions we're creating. Yes. It's Jackie. Would you like to?
I see your head nodding so much.
Yes, so much. Yes. Yeah, it's we're actually doing this series of interviewing folks, and we framed it, learned at Mama's Knee, but we're now kind of changing the term to picking green and being green. But anyway, the picking greens and being green. But the whole idea is to say that there are so many lessons that we have in our culture, in our history, and it's tales of culture, conservation, and community. And those tales really are just of ways that we have been, that we need to kind of get back to in terms of our relationship with each other, our relationship with the earth. And in those stories are just the rich culture is one of conservation, and without kind of the $1 billion conservation movement that actually has been has done harm to Frontline. To that, I one of the things that we from kind of a big swing is but on note that Clara just said, and that Ben also alluded to, when we what things that we're trying to focus on learn, they have to have a law degree, or they have to have the technical that explicitly goes on there to exclude them from those spaces. We really kind of coach people to say that you're the experts, you're the ones that they need more than anyone else.
Yes. So thank you so much. And by the way, Jackie, you were
yes,
you're breaking up just a little bit, but just to kind of reiterate what we were saying, maybe by the way, Jackie, you're able to turn off your video and then it'll come back. So, but I think we were able to take away some of that brilliance of what you were sharing, which is just that sometimes people think this is the type of knowledge and information that I need. This is the type of experience that I need. My other lived experience and perspective isn't valid for whatever reason. And that's one reason that stories, which Jackie started out talking about, are also critical. But I wanted to just look to you, Ben and Clara, from your experiences. And maybe starting out with Clara, you mentioned just being inspired by the story of Wangari Maathai, but I also know that you work a lot with young people, and I know that stories are something that we share a lot with young people. But just generally, from your perspective, what's the power of providing those stories and examples for people? And I would love to hear, even for you, what that power of stories has been.
Yes, that's a difficult question. I don't directly tell the stories, but I tell the stories. So I'm a musician, so I've used sometimes music as a way to tell a story of kind of what is happening and what can be experienced by people. And I always play this song that I've shared in multiple spaces, and I'm just going to say a couple of sentences of it just so all y'all can hear. Brace yourself. For so long, the people haven't pressed down. The system got me wonder where to break down. Sun up to sundown, working for my ransom, trying not to feel like I'm let down. But moving forward as I sway to the beat and finding my position as I prepare the heat. Swaying to the rhythm, feeling how I flow. A whole leap of concrete waves I swim through. So straight to the roots I go. So really about going to the root, using music in those spaces with young people. I found young stories allow people to come in a way that's human for them. I found poets who want to become musicians, who want to become environmentalists. I don't know how they interplay, but we need that poetry story to come in. So this is how I navigate with young people. They're more creative, they're more out of the box, and you need to have kind of an open mind to allow them to navigate their own creativity and bring that to the table. And then different, I mentored a young man who was a poet. I actually wrote a book about air quality in Pittsburgh and hosted an event and had different generations attending this and ended up doing a tree planting. But I was so inspired by the way he got science and made it into a poem, and anyone in the room could understand it. I was like, this is a skill that we need in the environmental space. So I found stories humanize and bring creativity and allow young people to really be who they are in this space.
I love
thank
that.
you.
I love that example, and I see people in chat responding so powerfully to your singing. So thank you so much for gracing us with that. But the piece that I take away from what you said before even going over to you, Ben, for your thoughts on just storytelling and representation and the power of that in what you've seen is, I think of this word translating. And often I think of the work that I do also as translating, right? You have information that's presented in one way. It might be the science and data of drawdown solutions, which are all like, it's all very important information, but at the same time, not everyone is able to, not everyone resonates with the way that information's delivered, and not everyone's able to wrap their head around the science and the data. And we could work to help people do that, which is important to navigate the world, but also we have to find ways to communicate with people and meet people where they are. That's really the phrase that comes to mind for me. But Ben, so interested in hearing your thoughts on this too.
Well, thanks, Matt. I'm hesitant to even try to follow Clara. And I think if we were going off of the wave in the chat, we would probably just cancel the rest of our discussion and have a small concert here this afternoon. But I'll give it a shot. So I think just to stick with the theme that we're responding here with this question, Claire's exactly right. I think we have to really gravitate toward the things that are going to resonate with people, whether that's poetry, whether that's music. But I think more generally, to your point, Matt, those stories of people's experience, of people seeing themselves in issues, and more importantly, seeing themselves in solutions, is really what's going to, I think, drive change. And as we were talking about a little bit earlier, that's ultimately what's going to get us away from inaccessible data points and nuanced discussions on technologies to the more accessible conversation, which is the real life impacts to and benefits also to people. So, I think we really just have to tell the climate stories of people. And that's why I appreciated our opening here today. It was just really starting with, what is the climate story that you bring to this conversation? And really just, elevating the stories of those who have been historically excluded, because as we know, so often throughout history, those are the stories that have not been told. And that's ultimately, how we have reached the frame that we're working within today. So I think just really, the power is in the story, because it helps bring folks to the conversation. It helps bring different perspectives to the conversation. And that's ultimately how we're going to create the solutions that we need to climate change.
Ben, I'm so curious, have you seen, are there any stories that come to mind for you that resonate most, or that you've seen successfully make space for a lot of the voices that have been historically on the margins of this climate space? It's always great to share those examples too, in case people are looking at how to model models for those conversations that they could have, and models for ways that they could amplify voices.
Absolutely. I think a couple of examples come to mind, and then I definitely want to, hear from Clara or Jackie if they have others. But, I think I'll put in a quick plug. I'm on the board of Climate Generation, a nonprofit here in Minnesota. And they've done a ton of work around storytelling and engaging folks to, really share their own climate stories. So if folks are curious and, maybe not familiar with climate generation, definitely encourage you to check out their website or their YouTube. And I think those are just some great examples of personal climate stories. And then Matt, I'll just put in a plug on your behalf. I think you are doing and have done great work, really telling stories of people and communities. And so, for folks who are here with us today, definitely encourage you to check out Matt's work and Project Drawdown's work around telling folks climate stories as well. So I think those are just a couple of examples that come to mind, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and I know that this is a question that will come up in the chat too around our storytelling work at Project Drawdown. So if you're curious to learn more or to sign up for updates, most importantly, I would say you could visit drawdown.org/stories, and there's a form that you could fill out to stay in the loop on what's going on with our storytelling. But I actually want to invite Jackie. I know Jackie is back in the building. Jackie, I don't know if you're able to join again on video, but if you are able, I'm so curious even to hear from you with if there have been any stories or anything in particular you've heard on your journey. I referenced Women of Color United, which I'm inspired by the idea that you could go on this road tour and have conversations with people around the world, because part of the work that I do at Project Drawdown is in that spirit, but also I wish more people would take the time to just go out and meet the world. Could you talk though about like any stories that have really resonated with you along the way that have really been effective at centering voices that have often gone unheard?
Yeah, thank you. So there's a few, and just even speaking about kind of the culture work that's gone into some of the storytelling, some of the compelling stories that I often use when I'm even doing talks are the Appetite for Change, which is there in Minneapolis, I believe. They did a great video where they're talking about everything from they're talking about nutritious foods, how they can't be found in their communities often, and how they're creating their own local food systems. The folks it's an organization called Solidarity in Highland Park, Michigan, have told a great story about how DTE turned off their electricity for their street lights, and how they came together and crowdsourced. And not only did DTE turn off their street lights, but then they went in and took away the street poles, figuring they were never going to be able to pay the bills. And the community came together, crowdsourced, built, re-erected street poles and put solar lights on that are now powering the lights for their communities. And they have that all in video. I'll put some links in the chat so people can see the Appetite for Change video and then the Solidarity video. It's one story. We were doing a training, and we always include storytelling. We're including drawing, poetry, songwriting, and so forth in our trainings and convenings. And one person stood up and said that she had her electricity turned off for non-payment, and she decided, she lives in Phoenix, Arizona, and she just kind of bought these cool, Phoenix, Arizona, where I was hotter there than I'd been in multiple visits to the equator. I mean, I've never been as hot as I was in Phoenix, but she bought her, she put away the money month by month that she would have put towards her electricity bill. And every few months she bought a solar panel until she had enough for an array. And then she was an electrician, so she got on her own roof and put those solar panels on her roof. And now she is completely off the grid, relying on her own solar panel. And I'll put her link to her story in the chat as well. So these are stories that definitely inspire us.
Wow. Yeah, and even I'm like looking at Clara too, and I think I think all of us are actually having a very similar, like, whoa, this is amazing. These are empowering stories. But I was just reading a book the other day from an author, and I'll see if I could pull up the quote and reference it earlier. But the idea of it, which is this idea that we will hear, I'm sure a lot of us have heard out there, is, this idea of you can't be what you can't see. And I like this quote because maybe it does simplify the idea of like representation and being able to imagine and become certain things. But also in so many ways, it's powerful that, when we're able to see a story of someone who climbs on the roof and, fixes their solar panels and fixes and does this incredible work, it expands our own idea of what's possible. which is really, really critical. But yeah, any other thoughts or reactions from Clara, from Ben on just this idea of stories? Clara, I feel like you have something to share, especially.
It's really short. Definitely no one's climbing on the roof in my story. It was very inspiring, Jackie. But I was recently inspired by, I did a tree planting last spring with some students in the Homewood neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And I remember we planted fig trees, and then we did another couple of trees after. But one of the little girls in there, she said, "What? I really enjoy doing this." She said the first time. Then the second time, "When I grow up, I want to grow forests." I was like, wow, this little Black girl now wants to do this work just because she's gotten this, and I don't even know her full background or how she came to that moment. But for me, that moment of representation and hearing this almost hopeful moment come out of that very brief, it was like a 30-minute planting experience that led her to feel like, wow, I want to do this kind of work. And for me, that story is like worth $1 million plus, because that's a life that's being changed, a perspective that's being shifted in such a short moment of time. So that's what I wanted to add to that. Ben, anything?
Yeah, I think it's incredible to hear these different stories and examples, and it only shows me and says to me that there are so many others. If each of us has these stories that we've been exposed to and have heard, I even think of your story, Clara, from Drawdown's Neighborhood, which we'll release in March, and just the everything that you've shared about what's motivated you, that has the power to help someone else find their own path and their own role when it comes to climate change and climate solutions. But, thinking ahead to the future and thinking ahead to the world that we want to see, and anyone, please feel free to start. Are there any particular opportunities that you see when it comes to creating more space for voices that are currently going unheard, creating more spaces for, for voices of not just Black communities and communities of color, but for like the LGBTQ plus community, for people living with disabilities, for women in so many cases too? How could we create more of that space from your perspectives?
I can get it started here, Matt, and then turn it over to Jackie and Clara. I think really the biggest opportunity that we have is we have the opportunity to create the first equitable and just transition of its kind. We unfortunately have many examples of folks being excluded during times of transformational change, but we don't have examples of a truly equitable transition in our history. And so we, all of us living here today, have an opportunity to change that. But getting more specific, and I'm going to try to pull out some of McKnight's strategies here. There's a lot of opportunities in energy and climate that I'm excited about. So electrifying buildings, for example, can reduce indoor air pollution, which reduces negative health outcomes like asthma, which disproportionately affects children of color. Transforming our energy system can help communities invest in renewable energy, like the example that we heard from Arizona, and move away from dirtier forms of energy generation. And making sure that folks have access to different forms of electrified transportation, whether their own electric vehicles or electric public transit buses, can improve air quality and help save money in the long run. So this is a really, systems-wide transformation that we're talking about, and we have the opportunity to make sure that for the first time in our history, it's one that's equitable and just.
Amazing. And and just continuing on, any opportunities, Jackie, Clara, that you see for us to, again, create more space for people to engage and really, at the end of the day, be part of the climate solution?
Jackie, I'll let you. I'm going to go. Okay, Jackie. Yeah, Jackie.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So super briefly, we have been concerned. One of the things that we are most concerned about is this Like even as we talk about groups that don't have a seat at the table, then there's subgroups within those groups that also even less so have a seat at the table. And as you know, our work is following in the footsteps of Shirley Chisholm, who says, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And so we really are we have brought on a cultural strategist to be as a full-time role on our team, who her role is, as part of her role, she is a language justice person. So making sure that we have all of our materials in our trainings and our convenings are translated in multiple languages, including sign language, and including having partnerships around Braille, for example. We also have our alignment initiatives department, which is specifically talking about how do we make sure that as we engage around labor, that we're also engaging Black labor. And so as we're engaging around, any of these kind of subgroups, whether it's youth organizing through Sunrise and Power Shift, how do we make sure that there's Black caucusing that's happening there? And so we are particularly trying to make sure that we are, and as you talk about LGBTQ communities, really explicitly partnering with groups like the LGBT Health Task Force. And so really being very, very intentional and explicit about always thinking of the folks who are invisibilized by this movement, who you aren't seeing at the table. So that's those are some of the opportunities that we're trying to create within the Chisholm Legacy Project. So thank you.
Yeah, and I know Clara is ready to jump in too. And before you jump in, Clara, I just want to remind people that now is a good time to use the Q&A box to ask questions, because we will get to Q&A in just a few minutes or in a couple minutes. But Clara, I know that there's this question about the opportunity that you see, but more when I think about you and the work that you're doing with the next, really with the I was going to say with the next generation, but really with this generation of learners who are starting to engage with climate. I just want to give you the floor to hear your insight and what you have to share, what you're excited about when it comes to the opportunity with them, but also in general.
Thank you so much. I'm learning so much from Ben and Jackie. In the One Tree Per Child program at Tree Pittsburgh, one thing that we've had some struggle navigating is the school system. As everyone knows, schools are like upended, and it's almost impossible sometimes to get on the radar of a principal when they're just trying to keep their school open. So that creates that problem where you want to have students engaged, but they're dealing with so much more outside of just wanting to plant trees. So an exciting opportunity that we found is partnering with same thing as Jackie was saying, nonprofits and groups that engage students outside of the school building. Maybe we worked with some immigrant communities, because we have a lot of immigrants in the Pittsburgh area, so that brings them into the fold. We've also worked with farms that, they're community farms, they're growing food and doing education, and then, kind of finding ways to collaborate in that capacity. And then recently I was turned on to community resource organizations that basically, I don't know how I don't know this, being in the United States since 2008, but you learn every day. But these are communities that are trusted, especially in communities that have been, disinvested with green spaces. So we're working to engage those groups more words are escaping my brain right now, just more deliberately. Yeah, we're just working to engage with those groups more deliberately to expand the type of impact that we have in the Pittsburgh area, who is at the table, and really taking our time. We have to respond to funders, but we also want to do it in a way that's meaningful to the community. So these other partners outside of the schools and out of your, natural way of progressing, I want to get this into a school building, finding more creative ways to engage the young people has been exciting. But one thing I found with young people is get their hands dirty. Teach them how to dig a hole and put a tree in and water it. That's going to engage them to want to do something. Even if they don't end up planting trees, somehow they're turned on to the fact that we are on this earth together, and they feel hopeful. Because the young people, we've been hearing so many studies, they feel like no one's doing anything. There's a lot of talk and no action. But through these small actions and getting them in the forefront, in that decision-making point, you start shifting a lot of their thoughts and giving them hope for the future. Yeah.
That's really powerful. And I thought of the phrase project-based learning as something that's really powerful for people. And it's always great to give people the chance to engage in that hands-on way. Before going to questions, I actually just want to ask a quick question to each of you. But is there are people who are tuned in, about 200 people who are tuned in right now, who are engaged with this conversation. But are there, is there an action that you hope that they could take, or is there anything that you want them to do based on this conversation?
Oh, I'll get us started and then turn it over to Jackie and Clara. So, I think first and foremost, just get involved. Whatever form that takes for you, whether it's volunteering for an organization or donating to organizations or just talking about these issues with your peers, your friends, and your family. But I think also, really in the theme of our conversation today, listen and be intentional. So, commit to ensuring that under-resourced and underrepresented voices are part of and leading the conversation. If you're in spaces where folks have been excluded or aren't being heard, speak up and dedicate yourself to learning or relearning how climate, race, and so many other issues are intertwined, and the role that we all can play in doing this work and making sure that we have a world in which we all can thrive.
Wow.
I'm gonna jump in. Hopefully I don't cut out at all. But mentorship, find a young person and mentor them. Exactly what Ben said. I think that's the biggest avenue that I use. We don't know the kind of impact we have on someone just listening to them, especially the young generation. The younger group need us to hear them. They have so many ideas, but if we don't hear, we miss the opportunity to create new realities for the future for all of us. So find a young person, mentor them, and then do everything that Ben said.
Yes,
Jackie?
also certainly ditto to both of those. The mentoring is so powerful and so needed. And yes, and also to what Ben said, I mean, really there's organizations all over the country that could use whatever support that people can give. And so, and the thing I would say too is practicing the James principles, which is around mutuality, around self-transformation, around really following the leadership, as Ben says, of frontline communities. And so when one goes and offers oneself, try to make it so that you're saying, okay, I'm offering myself to whatever you need, not like I'm willing to do this for you, or, so not kind of trying to direct, but really being directed, putting yourself in service to frontline communities would be great. And then knowing that not everyone can do everything, as long as you do something, it's a start. And so if it's reading an article and raising a conversation at dinner, if it's putting out a tweet that provokes conversation, whatever it is that is according to your means. I had someone she was sick with COVID, so down with COVID, and I was out there in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and you could tell she was just like literally typing from her pillow. She's just like, if I can do some research while I'm, she was just so miserable, but she's like, whatever I can do. And so, not to say that anyone should be going that far, but that's just to say that no matter what one's ability is or abilities are, then everyone can do something. So thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to invite in Josna Harris, who is here with some questions from our Q&A. So Josna, what are you hearing from folks in the chat?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of questions coming in, and just a note again, if you click on the thumbs up, it will actually upvote the questions so we can see which ones you'd most like to answer. So the most popular one is, how do you think we can support mental health of diverse youth during the climate crisis?
Such a great question. And if please feel free to jump in if anyone has immediate thoughts on that. One thing I would say though that comes to mind for me is, I think a lot about this topic of climate grief, and actually we've talked about this, Josna, too, just about, for me, how grief is a motivator in my story. I think of my dad Moses, who really lived through a lot of the civil rights era and experienced that as in his journey, and has overcome so much in his journey. And so for me, I I think it's so powerful to just make space for people in general to show up as themselves, right? Like when we're creating opportunities for people to share their stories, I think of the storytelling we do. Sometimes those stories veer into just negative experiences or challenges with mental health, and just letting people know that that is okay is one place that I would start. But I'm so curious how others manage that. And I think of you, Clara, first and foremost, just because I know you work with youth in particular.
Yes, that's a very big question. I'll answer a little bit of it. When we came back from the pandemic, well, we're still in the pandemic. When the schools opened up initially in August, we started some tree planting in September. And one particular school, I remember the teacher had teachers like students with different learning abilities, and they were very noisy and crazy in the classroom. And she said, I've never seen them behave like this, the way they behaved here planting a tree. We saw that the students were so engaged, listening to the steps about how to plant a tree, working together, students who apparently were having a hard time in the classroom. So I think in a way, exposing students back to the outdoors in some way, I think will help in some capacity to connect them again, especially with mental health issues. I personally take walks a lot to like just decompress, but I know it's really varied depending on what's happening with a person. But I just think exposure to nature in whatever way, it doesn't have to be a forest. It could be just touching the ground or doing art with your hands, but that short experience of working with the students planting, and then the teacher is telling us immediately, they've never behaved like this. You need to come back. The students, when are we going to plant trees again? Like, yes, that's what we want. So maybe creating space for that to happen in the school systems, just engaging students with nature is so crucial. Yeah.
Yeah, and just I know that we have so many questions too, and I'm sure that Jackie and Ben have a lot to add to this. But I'm curious if there are other questions. Maybe we're able to get through one or two more before we're at time.
Yeah, definitely. So the next question is, what narratives do you still find most lacking in this space? What are ways to engage younger folks, children in these conversations in a way that doesn't stir too much panic? Who do you think is doing that well?
Jackie or Ben?
I'll take the first part of that question. Thanks, Justin and Matt. So, I think really, we can always use more narratives, more stories of under-resourced communities and communities of color, really championing their own solutions. I think there's, examples certainly from different parts of the country. There's some great examples, even just in the Midwest, of, communities of color pushing back on fossil fuel infrastructure, for example. But I think, those are narratives that I would say are, to the theme of this conversation, less heard and really less elevated in our conversations from day to day. And so, I think to the question, we can always use more of those narratives, more of those stories, because, I think I've heard recently, the important part of this conversation is ensuring that we aren't, treating those who have been historically excluded as victims of the climate crisis, as folks who, don't have their own answers or their own solutions. As Jackie was saying earlier, everyone in these communities are experts. We just have to treat them as such. And so I think it's really ensuring that we are, elevating and championing those stories of folks, being resourceful, of folks developing their own solutions, of folks pushing back on some of these systems and structures that they've, been working within for so long. And so I think just really ensuring that we're thinking about how to really make sure that these narratives are actually reaching folks for a sustained time is first and foremost in my mind.
Yeah, amazing. I don't know if Jack, if you have anything to add there.
I would only say that the Healthy Gulf is an example of an entity that is explicitly working on narrative and storytelling for folks in the Gulf that are affected by everything from petrochemical corridor to the disaster. And I would also point out to the Center for Story-Based Strategy that is really focusing on narrative strategy, and they have some great tools around narrative strategy as well. So those are just two resources. Thank you.
Now, I think we might have time for one more question.
Yeah, I think this next one is actually a really good one to end on. And that is, how can we all help pass the mic? And how can we become more DEI centered in our public spaces?
Amazing. Please, one of you. I have so many thoughts on this question, but Ben, Jackie, Clara.
I'll be quick. I want to leave time for Clara and Jackie. I think, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but be intentional. Really, the important point in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice is being intentional about it. And if you are intentional about including underrepresented and excluded voices in the work that you're doing, that's going to go a long way. And so it all comes down, in my mind, to intentionality.
I couldn't agree more. I'm learning a lot by just listening to the partners that I'm working with before moving forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the one piece I would add is just it's the importance of I mean, it makes sense that I would say this, but the importance of stories, because for me, one thing that I've always found, and one reason I love storytelling, is because it really helps people see themselves, and it's so difficult to not see yourself and then find your way into a place. Sometimes it takes seeing people who look like you or who come from where you come from. And I remember in the interview that we did for Drawdown's neighborhood, Clara, I remember having a conversation with you about, the difference it can make to see one person whose background and experiences resonate with you versus seeing two people, and how meaningful that could be when you enter a room, or seeing someone in front of the room with a mic who is, who resonates with you in that leadership position, being respected. It makes a big difference. And so, just to echo what everyone's saying about being intentional, I would also say to really consider who's not in the room, who's not being represented. We like to talk and spend a lot of time on what we're doing well and how great we are when it comes to well, maybe anything, but when it comes to bringing voices in. But how can we be better is always the question, I think, that I'd encourage folks to ask. And if you want to kind of see stories and stay up to date on what we're doing with Drawdown Stories, to share those as examples to help people find and see themselves, again, I would just point you to drawdown.org/stories and encourage you to sign up to receive those updates as we roll out a bunch of exciting things. But Josna, I'll hand it back to you as we kind of come to a conclusion.
Well, I would like to thank all of our panelists for being here today for an inspiring talk. I have really witnessed the transformative power that stories have to drive change. And I'm so glad that you all are here today, really leading on that forefront. And I'm honored to join you. And with that, we're going to close out our session. Thanks to everybody in the audience for being here. And also, we have a lot more happening at the Great Northern Festival, and you can check out the full list of programs that are offered at thegreatnorthernfestival.com. Thank you.